Thank you, Deja. Appreciate the introduction. Happy Friday, everybody. As Deja said, I'm Katy Stowers. I serve in a VP role, legal counsel and consultant at NFP. We are a benefits, property and casualty and compensation consulting firm, formerly First Person. So some of you may have been exposed to us prior to our acquisition by NFP in 2021. Our company was called First Person. Abby, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm excited for the opportunity to speak with you all this morning. I actually see some familiar names on the participant list here, so that's very exciting. Abby Clegg, I'm the AVP of the compensation consulting portion of the practice. And really the topic today is a great opportunity for Katy and I to kind of tag team this monster of what is the FLSA, what are these classifications, what is the change that's coming starting in July. So just really excited for the opportunity to speak to y'all this morning.
Yeah. And we can start with a little history. So the Fair Labor Standards Act was a federal law that was passed by Congress back in 1938. This was a response in part to the Great Depression and what was seen at that point in time as exploitation of employees. Because before the FLSA, there were no national standards for things like minimum wage, child labor, overtime rules, no limitations related to a 40-hour work week. And so it was very much a pivotal piece of legislation. And in many ways, it created what we know today as the modern work culture. For this presentation, particularly today, we will talk about a couple of different aspects. One is some changes related to how you define an independent contractor, or what many will call a 1099 employee versus an employee who's paid through a W-2. We're also going to talk about exempt versus non-exempt under the FLSA. And really, the reason why it's important to focus on these things is they are areas of increased scrutiny by the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor pays very close attention to both employee classification as independent contractor or employee, and also then exempt versus non-exempt. As a general rule, kind of the overarching principle of the FLSA is that employers have to pay all covered employees, if they're not exempt, at least the statutory minimum wage and overtime pay of at least 1.5 times regular rates of pay for any hours worked over 40 in a work week. This rule does apply only to employees, not independent contractors, because independent contractors, frankly, aren't employees. And that's why it's very important to have a correct classification between an employee and an independent contractor. Now, there has been new guidance issued. It was issued in March of this year, really solidifying that distinction between employees versus contractors and that classification. What this new rule did was rescind a rule that was enacted in 2021 that narrowed the factors that you consider and primarily focused on 2 core factors in that employment relationship, those factors being control and whether the individual had an opportunity for profit or loss. Now we've kind of gone back to what the previous test was. It's an economic reality test. That's the one that Department of Labor now says is appropriate for determining whether someone is an independent contractor or an employee. And it looks at the totality of circumstances. And you'll see on the next slide that we're talking about six really factors that are balanced to determine if someone is an employer or independent contractor. There can also be state and local laws that impact this as well. But we're going to focus today on the FLSA. And that economic realities test, as I mentioned, essentially provides that a worker is not an independent contractor if they are, as a matter of economic reality, economically dependent on an employer for work. So really, if you think about that from a common sense perspective, that employee may work remote, they may work for other employers, but if they are economically dependent on you as an employer, your organization, you're going to be very likely needing to pay them as an employee. The first factor in this economic realities test is opportunity for profit or loss, depending on their managerial skill. So do they have skin in the game? Are they able to get paid more if whatever they're doing is successful? Are they going to feel the loss if it isn't? Also, what investments do they have to make versus what your organization has to make? So those investments are going to be also a critical factor in determining whether they are technically an employee. Also, degree of permanence of the work relationship. Are they coming in simply to do a project that's short-lived and then they'll be out? Or is it really a position that you intend to continue to work with long-term? Nature and degree of control. So how much control does that employer have over that employee's working conditions or that individual's working conditions? And the extent to which that work is an integral part of your business. Those two, nature and degree of control and an integral part of your business, if you just think about that, it really has to do with how reliant are you on this individual in your business. And then finally, does the position take skill and initiative by the individual, or are they really just told what to do? Now, what's critical in this change from the 2021 legislation was that no factor here is given more weight. You look at all 6. They may also allow you to consider additional factors, but all 6 are equally important. So potential consequences for worker misclassification, and this is what it's important to keep in mind. Workers can't voluntarily waive employee status. So someone can't say, I want to get paid as an independent contractor. I don't mind not being eligible for overtime. I don't mind paying my own taxes. If in fact they are an employee under the economic realities test, you have to pay them as an employee. They don't get to choose. They can't waive those FLSA protected rights. And Supreme Court case law has talked about this on several occasions, but essentially said that permitting employees to waive those rights would harm other employees and then also undermine the goals of the legislation, one of which is eliminating unfair methods of competition in commerce. The potential penalties for misclassification are key to understand. You may be ordered to pay back wages and benefits for those misclassified workers. There can also be federal and state income tax and withholding penalties that are pretty steep. For unfiled W-2s, so if it turned out you had 10 independent contractors who should have been receiving W-2s, you're going to pay $50 per form in just a tax. You'll also owe 100% of matching FICA penalties, 40% of the employee's contribution to FICA, and then 1.5% of the misclassified salary and interest on workers' wages. So the penalties can be pretty steep if you are misclassifying employees. Next, we get into the overtime rule. Again, I mentioned we need to think about employees being properly classified because if they're are and should be classified as an employee, they are subject to the FLSA's overtime rule. And under the overtime rule, employees are exempt from FLSA minimum wage and overtime protection if they are employed in a bona fide executive, administrative, or professional capacity, as those terms are defined by the DOL. That's called the EAP exemption. But if, in fact, they don't fall into one of these exempt categories, they are non-exempt, they must be paid overtime if they work more than 40 hours, and they must be paid at least minimum wage. If we look at the EAP exemption, so how do you take employees out of that non-exempt status? First, they have to be paid a salary, which means that they're paid a predetermined and fixed amount that's not subject to reduction because of variations in quality or quantity of work. So they had to work fewer hours, they didn't get as much work done, their pay can't fluctuate. They've got to have that salary basis. They also have to be paid at least a specified weekly salary level. And this is what we're going to focus on quite a bit because it changes in a couple of weeks, July 1st. So right now, and in order to be classified exempt, an individual would have to be paid a minimum of $684 per week. They also have to perform executive, administrative, or professional duties. as provided in Department of Labor regulations. And somewhere in this presentation, I believe I have linked to a fact sheet by the Department of Labor that really goes into a lot of detail on these executive, administrative, and professional exemptions, but I'm going to go through some of those details as well. There are also some additional exemptions under the federal regulations for things like computer-related jobs, outside sales positions, and there's even an alternative test for certainly highly compensated employees who are paid a salary, earn above a higher total annual compensation level, and satisfy a minimum duties test. So I'm going to get into a little more detail on these here as we move forward. So these EAP, executive, administrative, and professional exemption classifications, again, you have to be compensated on a salary basis at the DOL's required minimum salary and have job duties that meet one of the following. So in your executive classification, your primary duty must be managing the enterprise or a department or subdivision of the enterprise. You must customarily and regularly direct at least 2 or more full-time employees, and you have to have the authority to hire or fire employees or make recommendations regarding hiring, firing, and promotion that are given particular weight. And so, if you think about executive positions, these particular duties make a lot of sense. Administrative employees, on the other hand, and this is where I find, just as a practical matter, a lot of misclassification occurs. In that administrative exemption, the primary duty must be performance of office or non-manual work, and it needs to be related directly to the management or general business operations of your organization or of your organization's customers. You also have to include the exercise of discretion and independent judgment in matters of significance to be an administratively exempt employee. Lots to unpack with that, but one thing you want to really keep in mind is that we're talking about primary duty. So if 80% of the time they're answering phones, but 20% of the time they're doing office or non-manual work that is management related, that is impactful to the operation, that's probably not going to be an exempt position because only a small amount of what they're doing is that management or general business operations, independent judgment in matters of significance. So primary duty truly means that they have to spend the majority of their time doing work that meets this test. And then in the professional category, there's really 2 types of professionals. One is a learned professional. And in the learned professional classification, the primary duty must be performing work requiring advanced knowledge that's predominantly intellectual in character, that requires the consistent exercise of discretion or judgment. And the work has to be in the field of science or learning and customarily acquired by a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction. So here we're really talking about doctors, lawyers, CPAs. So you think about those classifications where you really have to go and get an advanced degree to do the work. Advanced degree is not the only requirement, but it is one of the factors that needs to be considered. Then that creative professional, their primary duty is going to be the performance of work requiring imagination, originality, or talent in a recognized artistic or creative field. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Then we get into a little more detail on computer-related and outside sales. So under computer-related, here we're talking about many of the things you might think about in IT-related skills. So systems analyst, programmer, software engineer in the computer field, where the primary duties consist of systems analysis, design, development, creation, testing, or modification of computer systems or programs related to user or system design specifications. So also machine learning, modification of programs related to machine learning, and any combination of these factors could lead to an exempt classification for computer-related duties. In outside sales, the primary duty has to be making sales or obtaining orders or contracts for services or use of facilities that will be paid by the client or customer. In this situation, really, some of the additional guidance from the DOL say 90% of their work has to be done outside of the office, directly engaging in outside sales. So if you have an employee who is in customer service, but occasionally finds a sales opportunity in doing their job, that person would not qualify for this exemption. It really has to be their primary duty. And then finally, and this one I think can give rise to some confusion, the highly compensated exemption. And in the highly compensated exemption, the difference here between executive, administrative, and professional is that it's a little bit of a looser test in terms of those duties. So if you meet that highly compensated threshold and you customarily and regularly perform at least one of the duties, so not all, with the executive, administrative, and professional classifications, you have to meet all of the duties in the test. In highly compensated, that relaxes a little. You only have to meet at least one of those duties of an executive, administrative, or professional employee and meet that total annual compensation minimum threshold. I'm going to get into that in a minute. This is another aspect of the regulations that changing is that total annual compensation minimum threshold. So yes, new guidance issued April 24th. It significantly increases the minimum salary threshold and HCE compensation threshold. And it's really important that you as an employer are examining your exempt employees and making sure that effective July 1st, they're meeting this new minimum salary threshold of $844 per week. It's the equivalent to a $43,888 salary per year. For the highly compensated threshold, effective July 1st, it is increasing from 107 to 132,964 per year. And with the highly compensated threshold, they have to be paid on a salary basis, at least that minimum $844 per week that applies to all the other exemptions. So that has to be kind of a set salary for them. But then you can supplement that with bonus compensation, non-discretionary bonuses, and other commissions, other types of compensation to get to that 132,964. January 1 of 2025, so not long after, so 6 months from July 1st, this is going up significantly again. So that weekly salary has to be $1,128 at a minimum, which is the equivalent of $58,656 on an annual basis. And the highly compensated threshold is going up to $151,164 per year. And again, you have to meet that minimum of $1,128 per week, paid on a salary or fee basis, and then you can look at total compensation for the remainder. Now, another thing new in these regulations that we've not had in the past is every 3 years, they're going to revisit these thresholds and likely increase them. So that will be effective July 1 of 2027. The agency will look at available data and the methodology used to set those salary levels and update them. And then every 3 years after, that's going to occur again, barring regulatory change. Yeah, the practical application of this, Abby, before we jump into how do we practically figure this out, is you've got to make sure that you're paying those minimums and that you're paying attention to what your employees are earning if you're wanting to classify them as exempt. This may require employers to reclassify some positions unless you want to do compensation bumps in order to meet it. Abby is now going to talk about a little bit about how you, as a practical matter, define these positions, their duties, and make sure that they're classified correctly.
Thanks, Katie. Absolutely. So I'm wanting to spend a little bit of time this morning, again, talking to that practical aspect and really the basis of that process or that analysis of trying to go through that examination of do my employees, do these positions meet those duties and requirements listed by the different classification types, starts with a job analysis or a job description review. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you could roll that out or things to consider if you're needing to evaluate this within your own organization. So taking a look, a little bit deeper dive on job descriptions themselves, they really are critical to help understand the proper classification under the FLSA, and can also help determine where a position should fall within your own compensation philosophy. It's important that a job description should really reflect the reality of the work that's being done. It's very common that we hear from our clients, it's been 5 or 10 or, even longer years since maybe we've taken a visit into our job descriptions and the content that's held in there. And really, we just want to encourage a little bit more of a common reflection. So can we take a look at those once a year or every other year to make sure that's what's listed in those documents is accurately reflecting what is being done in that day-to-day cadence. It's also important to note that the job description itself does not necessarily make or break whether or not a position should be considered exempt for those FLSA purposes. So again, it's really coming down to the work that's being performed to make sure that you're meeting those duties tests. However, it is a really critical aspect, again, for you to go through the analysis so that you can try to gauge whether or not you meet those regulations. Taking a little bit of a step back in terms of what is a job description. So what are the types of things that we should include in that document? We really like to recommend and make sure that it's a useful plain language tool that just helps to explain the major tasks, duties, the scope, responsibilities. So the key kind of overarching theme of what that position is responsible for. It's not supposed to include every single aspect of the job. I always kind of describe this as it's the what is rather than the how to. We would typically see those how-to documents reflected more in somewhat of a job aid or even a training manual for the position. We do need to make sure that includes the main aspects and the responsibilities of the job, but again, does not need to be all-inclusive.
What I find, Abby, so oftentimes I'm asked to perhaps look at a job description and say, do I think this would be an exempt position or not? It's really critical to me in writing those job descriptions that it's clear what the primary duties are of the job. So it's not just a listing of all the things they do, but really sets forth, are spending most of their time doing these things, what are their primary duties?
Absolutely. And we actually find that having those updated job descriptions are foundational for many pieces of employer law related compliance, in addition to what we've talked about today here with the FLSA and the exemption classification. So a couple other areas where we may see some use in having those updated job descriptions that are really reflective of the work that's being done. Starting off with recruiting. So it's one way in recruiting, as well as matching jobs to the external market for your compensation philosophy and your pay structure. It's one of the critical aspects to make sure in recruiting that candidates know what's a requirement, what is this job going to look like, should I apply, as well as trying to make sure that you have that external competitiveness when it comes to what similar positions are being paid in the market space. In addition, it's also important to share expectations of the job with your current staff. We also see job descriptions used as it relates to some of the ADA accommodations, so things like leave of absences, disability claim support. A lot of times job descriptions will include some different categories of how often should I be sitting or standing, or lifting a certain amount of weights. Those are all aspects that can be included in this document that can help track and keep things aligned with those other compliance pieces. Mm-hmm. And then the last one mentioned here, they're also helpful in trying to align performance reviews as well. So if you're able to kind of draft a performance management system that surrounds the expectations and responsibilities of the work that's being done, that can help align and to enforce that performance cycle. It's also helpful from an organizational design aspect so that you can review job assignments. What is the department and team alignment of work across departments and divisions and the organization as a whole. So you may be asking, how can we go through our job descriptions to make sure those are updated? And we really recommend having a little bit of a formal process in place. That way it's a consistent approach from job to job. You don't want to take a completely new approach from one position in one department to another position. So really setting forth a systematic formal study of the job, or what we may call a job analysis, is really helpful to make sure we keep all of those pieces aligned. So a couple key things to make sure we're including in that formal study. We want to make sure we're able to contain or gather information related to the nature of the work. So the duties, the responsibilities, as well as the level of work, which can sometimes be coined or termed as the compensable factors. So what is the skill level that's required here? What effort or responsibilities, as well as working conditions. In my next slide here, we talk about a few different ways to kind of go through that formal study. So first of which is direct observation. I've had the opportunity to participate in some of this with my previous employer, where a member of the HR team, or even, again, someone with some legal background as well, is able to really just shadow an incumbent in the position to gain some insights into what their daily or even weekly scope of work looks like. So that direct observation includes having people kind of partner together to go through those observations in partnership. You could conduct something similar to an individual interview. Usually that is with an employee. Typically it's a higher performing employee, not someone newer to the job who may still be on somewhat of a learning curve, but someone that's fully proficient in that work and in that role. Individual interviews can also be led or directed with the supervisor as well. So someone who has direct oversight over that position. Group interviews can also be helpful to kind of fill in the picture. So think more of like a 360 view of what's being required and asked of that position. For new jobs, especially in emerging fields, we see this a lot in the IT space or the technical space. You can go through a technical consultation. So that's a little bit of a partnership, typically outside of the organization, to understand the aspects of what's critically involved in that emerging field. The last two options here are a little bit more formalized in their approach, which includes open-ended questionnaires or highly structured questionnaires. So those are multiple choice. And typically, once those are developed, you're able to distribute those to a variety of different divisions, departments, and jobs to try to get a consistent flow of information in terms of what's required for that work. So again, wanting to kind of wrap up when we're thinking about writing a job description, or we've gone through some of these analysis or systematic reviews, what are some of the key things we want to make sure that we include? First and foremost is identifying major responsibilities and tasks. So again, it's not to be an exhaustive or an all-inclusive list. We find that it's usually helpful if you're able to order the responsibilities from those that are at the highest percentage of where an employee would spend their time to the lowest. Sometimes when I've gone through this work myself, I've actually assigned or asked to assign those percentages as well. So to Katie's point, if we're spending 80% of our time answering phones and 20% of our time in a scope of work that has more independent judgment, I know that the majority of my time probably doesn't meet that FLSA classification. Next, make sure that everything is organized and information is clearly and concisely put together. It's important here to try to make sure that you use easily understood terminology. So without any sort of jargon, corporate jargon, avoiding judgmental or vague words like this work is complex, or it's easy, or it's challenging. It's helpful if you can start the description of essential duties and responsibilities with action words in the present tense. So is responsible for, and then insert one of those present tense action verbs, rather than starting off with any sort of vague language. Using a standard template or a boilerplate, if you will, for job descriptions across the organizations just will keep you consistent in making sure that information is collected for every role really consistently, that nothing's missed, everything is present across the organization. And the last one here, I added, because again, I've done this work internally, and it's not always the easiest ask to say we need to be constantly updating job descriptions with the changes that an organization may view. So one thing that you can help to avoid some unnecessary updates in the future is to avoid using specific names. So instead of saying specifically, you know, I need to submit this report to Katy, I would maybe list Katy's position instead, or the head of Katy's department. It's the same for platforms as well. So software programs, Now, sometimes there's exceptions to that in the IT space, but if instead of listing out a very specific platform that you're currently using, the organization may change that in months or years to come. So it could be helpful to just insert what that type of program or what that type of language is. I wanted to spend a little bit of time as well, just walking through some resources that can be really helpful for developing well-rounded job descriptions. And I know there was a message in the chat. These slides are free to be shared with this group, which will have some of these screenshots and some of these links as well for some of these key resources. So the three I wanted to go over today are ONET Online, which is actually supported and backed by the Department of Labor. We'll also go through the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and then occupational information as well. So a couple screenshots from ONET Online. They have a really great search tool. There's other advanced search options and family occupational category searches that you can do with this group as well. But if you're not sure where you should start in terms of trying to draft together or go through that job analysis, ONET can be a really great place to kind of kick off your research. So in that search bar, you're able to type in a few keywords to try to pull up a position that you would find or assume is kind of similar to your own. In my examples here in the appendix, we're going to use a file clerk as an example, just to keep things a little consistent. So by typing that in my search, I was able to find anywhere across the ONET platform, which again is kind of sponsored through the Department of Labor, where we see those terminologies pop out. So it'll give me a code that matches against the Department of Labor's categorization of that role. And in this one, we're going to dive into the very first match that pops up, which is the file clerk option. And then I get a full summary report for that type of position. So this is going to include things like key tasks that we typically see with the role, technology that may be used in the position, as well as knowledge, skills, and abilities. It is a really great tool as well to get a little bit of a pulse in terms of what's happening in the compensation market. Compensation data is also available in ONET Online. You can see that from a national perspective as well as down to the local metro area as well. So really just a great tool to kind of pull things together. Again, if you're not sure where to start, it's got a lot of information all in one great space here.
And Abby, is this available? Do you have to subscribe or is it available free of charge?
It's available free of charge. So nice. I can see some faces. They may be trying to search now in Google. So just drop in ONET Online right now and you're able to log into the platform. No login is needed. It's a great platform, free for everyone. The information, so the compensation data, some updates to the tasks and skills that are listed here, they are submitted through some of those federal required reportings that organizations have to submit. So think of like your EEO classifications that comes in with, associated job titles, salaries associated. So some of the regulatory compliance reporting that organizations must do is what feeds into this system to collect the information. Next is the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics website. So again, free tool to use. You don't need a login or anything specifically. It's not quite as developed as the ONET platform, but again, still some great information. So they also have a search bar very similar to ONET. And again, we typed in that file clerk as an example here. And it's going to pull up a few different pieces. So we can see some general responsibilities and duties kind of listed on our first tab. You can also see in the tabs listed across the top there. It can describe a little bit about typical work environments that we see, similar occupations to this type of role as well. So maybe if you feel like this is not quite what your position does, but maybe is in a similar job family, it can help guide you towards what some other options could be. And again, there is some pay data both at a state and a local level as well, usually provided with the BLS site. And then my last slide here is occupational info. So this one, I started off with the most detailed resource, and then we're ending with the least detailed, but still a great place to start if you're not quite sure where to begin. So occupational info, the link was in my earlier mention of the start of the appendix. Again, searchable fields here. So we're looking for a clerical type of file clerk, And I get a more generalized description of what this work typically does or what expectations may be for this type of role. So hopefully if you're having finding the need that you need to go through a type of process like this, we're hopefully not having you need to start from scratch. And I think that wraps up the presentation. So I'd love to open it up to any questions that may have come in, or if anyone has questions now that we can take.
I will say too that while people are thinking of their questions, that when I'm looking at positions from an FLSA exemption perspective, there are great resources online, both with the Department of Labor fact sheets and just other guidance and interpretations out there on particular roles. So one in particular that can be really tough to classify is someone being an accountant versus being the CFO. And a lot of times employers will assume, well, if they're an accountant, they had to go to school for that. It must be an exempt position. That's not really true if their general duties are things like billing and accounts receivable and things of that nature that can be, highly skilled, but more clerical in nature. You're going to need to classify that position as non-exempt. It's when you get into those areas where you have those specialized skills and responsibility independently for managing that part of the organization where you're going to get more into an exempt role. So it's not always easy to tell on its face. So it's a good idea on some of those to really kind of do some research and see if there's guidance out there that says how you really should classify a role.
I'd like to throw out another example, Katie, as well of, so my example, I come from a healthcare background. And even though a position may meet the qualifications for exempt status, that does not mean an organization necessarily has to go through with that status. So
Right.
the position that comes to mind from my healthcare background are advanced practice providers. So roles like a nurse practitioner or physician's assistant. So they definitely meet those requirements as listed by that learned professional category. A lot of schooling, a lot of certification goes into those types of roles. But most healthcare systems may actually look to pay those positions on an hourly and a non-exempt basis to help incentivize for when, some of those providers need to work overtime. It's also a way that they can help classify other unique circumstances surrounding their pay model or pay design. So again, just because a position does meet the qualifications, it's not to say that an organization is forced to go with an exempt classification. It could still opt to go non-exempt.
Yeah, and I have that conversation not infrequently with employers where, if you do an analysis, yes, potentially it could be exempt. Maybe it's on the line, or it's because these things can get really gray. Err on the side of non-exempt if that's the case. If it's one of those where it could go either way, or if it's just consistent with how you've previously classified a role and people have that expectation of overtime pay, you can keep them non-exempt. There's nothing wrong with that. I do see a question in the chat. What are the chances that this overtime rule will be challenged or suspended? That has happened in the past, I think, with the rule that was enacted in 2018. I see Tina from Firefly on here. I know we had some conversations about this way back then. That at that time when they were raising the salary threshold, it did get stayed pending a court challenge. There has been a court challenge filed against this new guidance. It was filed toward the end of May, but it has not at this point led to any sort of stay or suspension of the rule. I talked with a couple of my Krieg DeVault colleagues. I serve part-time in an of-counsel role at Krieg DeVault about this very question, because I've gotten this question from several employers, like, do I really have to do this, or is it just going to get suspended? And they were both of the mindset that based on past practice and essentially the climate right now, that it likely will be going forward on July 1st. The biggest potential for a change in the future is a change in administration. And that's what we had when we look at that independent contractor classification stuff. The 2021 rule was a Trump administration rule that was put in place right before the administration went out. And now the new administration has had a chance to look at that and decide they want it to be different. So a lot of these things, when they're based in regulation, it will be dependent on how the administration interprets and their philosophy on the rules. But I don't think we're going to catch a break by July 1st.
Katy, do you understand the maybe the logic and why they increased it, the one in January, by so much? I think for many of us, talking to my peers, the one in July isn't so bad because, most of us are going to clear that one. But, the one in January is a $15,000 jump, which is drastic.
Yeah, and I think in prior versions of this, they had that more drastic jump immediately, and that when the administration sought comments on the proposed regulations, they got a lot of pushback on that. And the kind of the stair step was really a result of the commentary as the proposed regulations were being considered. And I think they were just trying to compromise. But 6 months is not very long.
So is the goal really to force us to make everybody hourly?
I can't say that's true. It's either to compensate them more fairly in the administration's eyes by raising the pay, or making them hourly and allowing them to earn overtime.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Abby and Katie, Maggie has raised her hand. So Maggie, I want to allow some space for you to ask your question.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Actually, my question is, I have a specific employee. We're a nonprofit, and so I have a specific employee that I'd like to chat more about. That would be the only employee that this is going to affect. Is this the appropriate time or place to ask that, or could I maybe follow up individually?
I feel like we have the time, and other employers might learn from the question. So if you want to put it out there,
Okay. Yes.
I think as long as Deja tells us we have time, let's do it.
We're good.
Perfect. So this employee is she essentially retired, but luckily came back to work for us in a part-time capacity. She's a fundraiser, although she helps us with annual fund planning, so projects that go into, kind of strategy or putting together projects that help us fundraise in general, as well as, it's almost like sales, right? She has individual folks that she goes out to, meet with and solicit.
Sure.
So, and she's part-time, and we've been paying her the salary, non-exempt over the salary threshold. But I don't know about, getting up to some of these numbers, how we would look at that.
Yeah, so it sounds like, that's a bit of a tough one. Is there an opportunity for even to work over 40 when she isn't truly a part-time position?
I mean, no. So she works 3 days a week, so she's off Wednesdays and Fridays.
So overtime wouldn't really be an issue. I don't believe these rules require that you pay someone an hourly rate. If they're non-exempt, you can pay a non-exempt individual, I think, on a salary basis based on the number of hours that you anticipate they will work. And so it may be that you don't have to change that practice, but you would have to watch. And if her time starts getting close to that 40-hour threshold, consider paying her overtime at that point.
So I'm sorry, so you're suggesting to keep her exempt?
Well, she wouldn't really be exempt. She'd be non-exempt, but paid a salary.
Okay, non-exempt, but paid a salary. And that's okay that non-exempt paid salary would be under that threshold.
Yes, as long as she doesn't get to 40. If she gets to 40 hours, you would need to pay her overtime based on that that salary, the hourly equivalent of what that salary is.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Abby, I saw you shaking your head. Do you agree?
Yes, I've had that again at a previous employer, that exact mix. So the topics of your FLSA exemption and whether or not you're paid salary or hourly, even though they seem very connected in the presentation today, they are really kind of two distinct areas. So I have had those non-exempt, so would be eligible for the overtime category of working over 40 hours. So a non-exempt, but paid on a salary basis. As some of my employee classifications in a previous life, one of the most important things, and Katie mentioned this, one of the most important things with those types of settings and breakout types is that you are still tracking time of that employee, so that you know if they do get close or are getting close to that 40 hour, and that you would need to pay the overtime should they exceed that threshold.
Yeah, and Ruba asked a question in the chat, just clarifying, is it 40 hours that requires overtime pay or over 40? It is 40 is the cutoff. So anything over 40, you must pay overtime for.
And then we also have a couple other messages in the chat. The first one being from Kim Teague. She asked, what is the practice if an employee is serving in an executive or professional role but does not fall within the threshold compensation? Is this an evaluation of compensation or an exempt versus non-exempt issue?
Well, it would be really both, if I understand the question right. First, you would need to look at their overall duties and see if they truly are working in an exempt executive role. If in fact they are, then you would need to look at compensation and see, do we need to raise compensation to get above that threshold? Otherwise, you would have to pay them overtime.
Perfect, Kim. I hope that answers your question. And then we also have a question from Maggie after that. She asked if you could talk about the difference between a salaried non-exempt and salaried exempt position. Specifically, how to determine if a role falls into one of those types of roles.
Abby, do you want to take that one? I think you touched on it here just a minute ago.
Yeah, sure. So that was a little bit of the example of what I just gave. So really in those two different categories, someone would be placed in that salaried non-exempt if they don't meet, really the duties test is one of the primary things that you would want to keep an eye on. So if they don't meet the qualifications for that executive, administrative, professional, or those other types of exempt classifications that Katie listed, and then they're likely need to be classified as non-exempt. Now, you can still pay a non-exempt classified position on a salary basis. You just need to make sure that you are still tracking time so that you know if that position or that employee works in excess of the 40 hours within a standard work week, that they're eligible for the overtime. So it's really the duties test is the biggest thing that comes into question on whether or not you should consider that salaried non-exempt or salaried exempt position.
Perfect, thank you. And then we have another question here in the chat from Katy. She said, we have several employees that are classified as salary non-exempt. We use the fluctuating work week method to calculate/pay overtime. Were there any changes to the fluctuating work week method with the most recent FLSA changes?
Yeah, great question. There were not any additional changes to methodology beyond what I've talked about with respect to the salary thresholds.
And we have one other question here in the chat. Ali asked, what kind of strategies would you recommend for a hybrid work environment and time tracking? It's a great question.
Abby, have you come across this with any of your client work?
I have. We're bringing up all kinds of things from the past, good and bad. So a couple strategies consider if you have a hybrid work environment or even mainly remote as well. Try to, if you can, and you have a robust system in terms of an HRIS or a payroll system, A lot of those systems come with the ability to track time. It could be a separate module breakout. In my past life, I have had employees track a little bit more manually. There's always a little bit of a subject in terms of, it's subjective whether or not how accurately that's getting, recorded. So one of the most important pieces is to make sure from your employee handbook perspective, you have some really clear guidelines on how time tracking should be done for your organization. And then if you can partner with usually a software program is one of the greatest, primarily if it can be associated with your payroll system as well, to help facilitate some of that. So again, in a hybrid or remote working environment, I've even, personally had the ability to go in and track my time when I'm, logging on for work, stepping away for lunch, logging back on from breaks. So it is really helpful for the employee to have really quick access to some of those timekeeping systems.
Great questions. I want to allow a few moments here. If anyone has any additional questions, we have time for maybe one or two more.
And our contact information is included on the presentation if something comes up after.
Yes, and I will be sharing out. You guys are good to share the slides, right?
Sure.
Okay, so I'll be sharing out the slides, the resources that were discussed, just key takeaways, those kinds of things. So like as Katie and Abby mentioned, their contact information will be in there, and I'll also highlight that in the follow-up email as well.
Perfect.
Perfect. Any other questions?
Well, thanks for being a great audience. We really appreciate the interaction, the discussion. I know it's probably helpful to everyone on the call to hear from you on, situations that you experience. So really appreciate the interaction.
Yeah, and this was a great conversation. We appreciate you guys coming with such great information and explaining it so well. I think you put it in really relatable and understandable terms. So we appreciate the context. As far as the next call, we all invite you back to our next sector call on July 19th. We will be discussing fundraising trends and how to engage your donors. So that call will take place July 19th, right back here on Zoom, Friday morning, 8:30, bright and early. So we hope to see you all back. And again, thank you so much for the conversation today. I hope that you all took away some really important information. And if you have any questions you want to stick around for, please, we welcome that. But thank you all again, and have a great rest of your day.
Yes, thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
Everyone.